Welcome to a new session of Facebook Live, and my name is Gülçin Karadeniz. I work in the European Environment Agency's communications team. I'm joined here by two colleagues, Andrus and Rainer. Would you like to introduce yourself very briefly?
Hello, I'm Andrus Meiner. I'm currently acting as a head of group in Geospatial Information Services, but I'm also considering myself as a land use expert. Yeah.
Hello, good morning. My name is Rainer Baritz, and I'm the soil expert here at EEA. By training, I'm a forester, but I'm specialized on various issues related to soils.
So, as you might have imagined, we will talk about land and soil today. If you have any questions during the session, please post them in the comments section, and I'll be forwarding them to our to experts. Mm-hmm. We have recently published a report, Signals, that talks about this issue, so we will be referring to that during our conversation. But maybe we start with a very basic question. Why should we care about land and soil? Why are we working on that? Andrus, maybe we start with you.
Well, land is indeed everywhere. We are stepping on it, and as such it represents a territory or a ground where we can place our life and our buildings and things we do. But at the same time, it is also the key resource to provide food for us. We are producing crops and forages on this. But apart from this, it is also a key element in our nature to support different natural cycles, because air, water are all using land and soil as part of its cycling. Eventually, land is a big part of our cultural heritage. It is providing us for recreation. It is containing a heritage in this, and it gives us a cultural feeling of our surroundings.
Of course, landscape has shaped different cultural landscapes as well in Europe. What about soil?
Well,
why should we care about soil?
Well, as Andrus pointed out, soil is an important element of land. Our animals and our food depends on soils. Plants grow in soils, and the two most essential issues or elements that plants need are nutrients and water. And soil is the very element or the very natural resource which mediates and makes available nutrients and water to our plants. So if the soils wouldn't be intact, then our plants wouldn't grow well, and then our food would not be the way we would like to have it.
What happens? I mean, the soil in itself is like a cosmos. What happens in the soil? Can you just tell us a little bit about it?
Well, plants can only take up nutrients in a very elementary and a very essential form. And in food, nutrients are chemically packed in a very complex manner. So we need to break down the nutrients from complexity to simplicity so that they can be taken up. And this is the role of soils. So
if I understand in non-expert language, soil prepares the feed for plants to grow.
Exactly.
So nutrients are what feed the plants.
Yes. Right. And this is not just a purely chemical or physical reaction like soil as a reactor. It's actually biologically mediated. We are usually not aware that in soils we have about 10,000 to 10 million different taxa, different organisms in a tablespoon, in a gram of soil, in fact. So it's hugely complex, and it is a trophic chain. Something that when you just grab soil, you're not aware that this is actually, let's say, taking our stomach upside down. No? So we have a digestive system which interacts on the base of many organisms.
Mm-hmm. We'll come back to some of these, organisms and the wonders that they actually perform above the ground, but below the ground. But maybe to go back to above the ground, we can also see that the landscape has been changing. And the agency works on that. What are the trends that we can observe, or what is stable, what has changed in the last decades?
We like to look at the land as a system, and this means that it has its biophysical or natural part, but also the human part. So the biophysical part is represented by the concept of land cover. It is basically what we see on the surface of the Earth, and we can often use remote sensing to get understanding about the process.
You mean satellite images?
Yes, satellite images, but also other airborne devices. But in addition, there is also a component of usage of the land use, which is represented by humans' decisions for allocation of our activities on the land. And this is, of course, more challenging to see and monitor, and we cannot use satellites to really get to this. Nevertheless, these two elements come together, and we often use land cover information also to understand what are the main processes, the land processes on the surface. For example, one of the key pressures that we have noticed is constant increasing of urban and infrastructure areas. So we also measure this by soil sealing. This is directly from satellites. And we have been reporting over the years about trends in this that we don't consider to be sustainable. So that's why we've been asking for reducing the urban expansion by possibly more compact usage.
And asphalt, etc., which you did mention soil sealing. What is soil sealing? What does it do to soil?
Well, so sealing is, in principle, the coverage of soils with artificial material. There are different degrees of sealing. If I only plaster my garden, it's still open, it can absorb water. But if I use asphalt or concrete, then the soil surface is sealed. And eventually that leads to disruption of the soil functions that were previously active. A large proportion of the soil biological system dies. And so if you would ever want to recultivate the soils, it's extremely difficult. Mm-hmm. In soil science, we usually talk about that the soil is actually destroyed, and it's not possible to put it back into management unless you ameliorate, you put in nutrients, organic matter, and many things to actually get soil reactivated, but that's really difficult. So basically we talk about a complete loss of soil. Mm-hmm. From other uses of management, for example, agriculture is not possible.
Okay. What are, maybe while we are on the subject, what are the other pressures that soils face?
Well, in Europe, we are a very dense society. We have in EU 28, so in the 28 member countries, we have almost 2.8% of our land sealed off. So this is a huge amount. So when we talk about sealing, then this is the most important threat that we have to soils in Europe. Other threats come from the industrial use of the landscape. So waste, for example, and also industrial uses and leakages are the second most threat to soils. We call it point source contamination. It's a complicated term. But
it's pollution.
But the introduction of chemicals into soils from industrial activities, this is the second most threat to soils, and then various other threats that are related to intensive agricultural management.
Mm-hmm. So what happens when a soil is contaminated or an area is contaminated?
Complex question. What we do, as you know, in the European Environment Agency, we work with member states, with member countries in Europe, and they all have their regulations of how to deal with it. And what they do is they look into studies that tell experts at which level human health or the biological system is concerned by the introduction of chemicals. So when do they become toxic? And that leads to thresholds. So we apply these thresholds to soils and chemicals in soils, and that helps us to get an idea of where a soil is. So we can actually introduce substances also into our system, and this is what we want to prevent.
Okay. If you have any questions, please put them in the comment section, and I'll be forwarding them to Andres and Rainer. Maybe to go back to what you were referring as different uses of the land. So you did mention the industrial sources, pollution, etc. What are the other trends that we can observe? You said cities are growing at this rate. Maybe we need more compact cities. What else can we observe on the land use or land cover statistics?
Indeed, we are monitoring the so-called land balance of Europe. So, which means that if something is growing, something has to decrease.
Of course, it's a finite, it's a limited area,
yes,
right?
Exactly. We have been observing that the first victim to urban expansion tends to be agricultural area because they tend to surround the urban areas, and whenever we expand our urban spaces, we normally sacrifice the cropland or pastures. And this trend has been quite worrying because this is basically a loss of productive land and in a way is undermining our food security. At the same time, there are also other areas which could be lost, natural and semi-natural areas. However,
what are those? What do you call semi-natural areas?
Well, some grasslands which are not exactly for agricultural production, or some sparsely populated, sparsely vegetated areas, also wetlands, and last not least the forest, which is the biggest land cover type in Europe. However, we have noticed that the forest has not been suffering to that degree as agricultural areas. So that's why we can be relatively satisfied with our forest trends. In some places there might be intensification in forest use, but forest area as such has not been decreasing in recent years.
Okay, that should be slightly reassuring, I hope, but loss of agricultural land could be a concern. How does that impact soil when it comes to agricultural land being used? There's less of it. We talked a little bit about contamination. How do we grow our food?
Well, we are in an era of increasing populations, especially in urban areas. So that pressures to the agricultural sector to produce enough food. At the same time, we notice, as Andrus said, that we lose agricultural area. So how can we maintain the level of production in agriculture that we need to sustain our feeding? And so we fear that this leads for the remaining area to increased pressure. So that you use more fertilizer, this is the addition of nutrients into soils, in order to increase the production of the crops in the remaining land, or to expand that into natural, semi-natural areas, as Andrus pointed out, that we also find imbalancing our ecosystems. So we observe that these pressures for the remaining land increase, and at the same time, also as Andrus pointed out, we see this area being increasingly fragmented. So the pressures from urban sprawl into also rural areas is a fact that we can see in the combined fact with the loss of agricultural land. So we are highly concerned about this trend, and this has not stopped over the last year since we have our observing system going, and this is something of our biggest concerns.
What happens when there is too much fertilizer used? How does that impact the natural environment?
Well, we have that at the moment. We have areas in Europe where the inputs of nitrogen into soils are really high and are in fact higher than the capacity of soils to buffer this without having an effect that nitrogen ends up in the groundwater. So we have areas where we have a threat to the purity of to the quality of our groundwaters. And the addition of nitrogen through fertilizer can also disbalance the system. So when you offer of a certain set of important nutrients too much, then the others are also needed to a high amount. For example, basic cations, what we have, other nutrients, let's say, and they need to be added. Mm-hmm. So in order to counterbalance an increase of nitrogen, for example, you want to put in more fertilizer from another side. So that leads into a reaction of something that tries to balance out a system that is put into imbalance. Another important side effect that we observe from excess nitrogen, for example, is the loss of species diversity. So that focuses
in the soil or everywhere?
The plants grow in the soil. Different plants have different qualities of litter when the quality of the plant components, and then when they come back to the soil, they also affect the soil system. So let's say it's one system. No? But this is also maybe a reason why in soils we are very concerned about the richness of plants in the environment, because they affect also the richness of species you have in the system.
So the whole system could be impacted.
You want an intact system, you want a diverse system, and excess nitrogen actually goes in the opposite direction.
So I would say that we need to fertilize our soils rather than the plants. Is that correct?
Well, surely we need to fertilize the soils.
We have our first question from Bertrand. How can European soil be sustainably managed if it is not regulated by European directive?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because as you know, you may have observed that we are struggling in Europe with the establishment of a soil policy. We have a communication, a strategy that guides us of how to do this. And one aspect is to, in fact, develop an independent policy. Another way to achieve this is to include soils in various policies. And so the agriculture policy is very important. And we see that for the soil threats, erosion and also soil organic matter, carbon in soils, we have an increasing amount of awareness. Also effects of the common agricultural policy on soils. So here I would, from our point of view, that would be a successful example of how soil is covered in policies. But there are other areas, for example, salinization, salts in soils from irrigation, for example, compaction. In certain ways, even sealing are not very well covered in existing policies. So we still have quite a bit to do in this area.
Maybe just to ask, isn't soil and land use actually quite local problem and local issue? So because looking from my point of view, soils could differ, the way that people use the land could differ. Isn't it very difficult to actually come up with a European level policy on this matter? Or how can it be done?
Yeah. Well, this is certainly one of the aspects, and probably also one of the reasons why we don't have a dedicated central policy on land and soil. However, there are many policy instruments which are existing. So I would say that the more of the problem is the fragmentation of existing policy landscape that regulates this field. But you're right that local use decisions are made by land managers on the spot, on the local.
Who are the land managers?
Farmers, foresters, urban planners, people who are acting really in the local agenda, to the national, to regional, to the local level.
You did mention something on the policy fragmentation, but I want to follow up something that you mentioned earlier about the landscape fragmentation.
Yes, landscape.
What is it?
Yes, landscape fragmentation is a concept that we are advancing by developing a specific indicator. This indicator is based on the remote sensing data of soil sealing and is using the best information on transportation networks. By combining these two, the urbanized areas or sealed areas and the transport infrastructure, we are creating some kind of fragmenting geometry. This is basically the areas which are dissecting the European continent, and by that are cutting our ecosystems into smaller and smaller pieces. So this is not a good thing.
Why?
Because organisms, animals need to migrate freely, and each of those transportation or urban areas becomes an obstacle for their free movement.
Is there anything that is done to prevent that?
Well, the first thing from our side was really to create knowledge about this. That's why we are monitoring the progress about landscape fragmentation. And though we have seen that it has been decreasing in the recent years, and perhaps this is due to our policy interventions, at the same time the landscape fragmentation is still increasing in Europe. So we are building more and more roads, and we are dissecting our natural landscapes more and more.
But I read somewhere that there were these, wildlife crossings, etc. So they build some sort of a bridge over.
Green bridges. Yeah.
Does that work? Is that a good idea?
It certainly helps, but more fundamental approach from European level is green infrastructure strategy. So EU has a specific policy document to promote connectedness of green areas across Europe. And we really hope that this is the good counterbalance for fragmentation.
Okay, so hopefully that will help.
Yes.
I want to pick on something else that you mentioned about the carbon and soil organic carbon, the amount of carbon that is stored in soil. What is it, and why should we care?
Well, carbon, the function of carbon in soils is maybe the element that has the greatest variety of functions that we know. So you see carbon in the soils when the soil is turning black. That is an indication that organic matter is stored in the soil.
Is that good?
And this is a very good thing for the following reasons. Organic matter has the ability to store many nutrients and to have a so-called reactive surface that allows microorganisms in interaction to feed from, and also to be in interaction with the mineral substrate. So the nutrient cycle that we observe in soils is a product, but also a reactor for which soil organic matter is the very indicator that we can observe. So if you see a dark soil, you usually, as a soil scientist, say this is a soil that has lots of organic matter in the soil. So at some point, lots of plants were produced. The material was incorporated in the soil, digested, and then stored as organic matter in the soil.
Mm-hmm. And I also read that we might be losing a part of this soil organic matter.
Well, you could say
Carbon.
over historic management, of historic areas of land management, we have lost on the standard terrestrial side. We're not talking about wetlands. More than half of the initial carbon stock in soils. So we have depleted our soils massively from organic matter. And from a greenhouse gas point of view, we know from climate change, when we deplete the soils from organic matter, CO2 is released. And in fact, I actually should have mentioned that maybe, that when soil organic matter is built up, CO2 is bound. So we are talking about a carbon sink when we build organic matter. But what we do through management, we lose it. And what is extremely difficult nowadays is where we have formerly organic or wet soils under management. So when the cultivation pressure exceeds into wet areas and we start managing, training the soils and managing them, that releases enormous amount of carbon dioxide. So from that point of view, the management of organic matter-rich soils is a hotspot in Europe for the European greenhouse gas balance, and extremely sensitive from a soil point of view.
Okay, so it needs to be taken
protected,
into account.
Actually, yeah.
If you have any questions, please post them in the comment section. And we have another question actually from our follower Bertrand. What about soil and SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals? Because some of these goals are linked to soil. Is it a global issue? What is the intervention level that we need?
Maybe I just kick it off, but I hand over to you. Well, we are quite used to think that land and soil is mostly targeted by so-called 15.3 target of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 15 is life on land, and 15.3 is about land degradation at large. But it is clear that soil is not only subject for this target. And this is where I would hand over to you, because it's going really deep in the SDGs.
Yeah, I'm actually very happy for the question. The SDGs become more and more as a guiding principle also for us. We see land being overused and degraded, and it affects all areas of the society. And the SDG represent this. And if we go into detail, as Andrus pointed out, land degradation, ecosystem services, ecosystem condition is well identified. But there are also other SDG areas, 2.4, 15.2, where sustainable agriculture management, sustainable forest management are addressed. And in these different goals, soils are quite, let's say, prominent. Even though you could say on the technical level, how we observe the condition of our environment, soils are not necessarily well established as indicators. This is where we actually need to improvement. Soils as indicators is currently mostly established at what Andrus pointed out, land degradation, where organic matter, what we just talked about, but also soil erosion is monitored.
What is soil erosion?
Soil erosion is one of the soil threats. That I would say we mentioned soil sealing as being the number one soil threat in Europe. Soil erosion is the number one soil threat globally. And erosion means that you have an unprotected soil surface, and in combination with harvesting actually, but mostly rain, heavy rains, the soil is transported off-site. It's washed away so that the topsoil is lost, and the fertile crust, we talked about the living soil, the organic matter-rich soil, that part of the soil is then lost, and as a consequence, the soil is less productive. So this is more physical degradation.
I guess affects many communities, and because soil and land is a finite resource, so I guess it's very difficult to replace.
Exactly. So in the perspective of the human generation, we consider soil as non-renewable resource.
Yes, and erosion is, besides sealing, is when you have the soil completely lost. In erosion, you also have it lost at the site, and it's transported somewhere else. Not necessarily to make another site maybe more fertile, but it's also transported offsite into river streams, and it fills dams and so on. And to come back to your transboundary effect, yes, soil and land is a local resource. It has local ownership, but the off-site effects can be transboundary. And erosion is a very good example that this can happen.
Well, there's something that you mentioned that I want to pick up, and this is something that the agency works closely with. It's about remote sensing and satellite imagery, etc. So there is a question about, of course, local and global and regional kind of picture, let's say. What does the recent knowledge trends or knowledge sources tell us, like Copernicus?
Well, we are addressing the land and soil on very different levels, starting from monitoring, but also managing the data sets and producing the knowledge products like indicators and assessments. But since you asked about Copernicus, and this is the most obvious thing to mention, because we are acting as an entrusted entity for Copernicus Land Monitoring Service. And this is a big task for us to fulfill. We have a special team in the house that works on everyday basis to produce the products which are filling up these services. We interact also with other services like atmosphere, climate, and or even marine, if it's not that relevant for today's context. But the land monitoring service and in situ coordination, which is a ground-based measurements, non from satellites, these are the two main tasks that we are carrying out. We have a number of products. They are available on a dedicated Copernicus portal.
Well, what does it tell us? What do these products, as you call it, tell us?
Well, these products are designed to monitor the land processes. We are producing data on different aspects and different levels. For example, we have worked for many years on a product called Korean Land Cover. So this is a land cover change mapping, which is valid for entire EU and all 39 countries that we are work with. The main advantage of this dataset is that we are able to provide the change time series already since 1990s, and this is one of our big sources of information on trends. But we are complementing this with much higher resolution, means more spatial detail, the new products. These are specific for forests, for wetlands, for the soil sealing we mentioned earlier. And we're also working on so-called thematic hotspots, like urban areas, like areas along the rivers, so-called riparian zones. We are building the new products for coastal zone, for example. So these are other examples of different products that are designed to monitor the land.
Okay, and all that information is actually available free of charge on different websites, so you could maybe share the link. We have another question from Bertrand, and why isn't there a pan-European mudslide indicator? Would that be useful?
Actually, we have, let's say, landslides are identified as a soil threat, but landslides are very difficult to monitor across Europe because every regional government, sometimes national governments, have their own way of looking at landslides. So for us to develop an indicator where we monitor landslides and to bring that further into a policy is very complex. We are working together with different institutions, for example, the Joint Research Center in ISPRA, it's a European Commission research institution, on the prediction of the predictive capacity of where could we have landslides. So we work technically in an exchange with countries to build our knowledge base, but we are not at the level where we could say we work on a policy. This is a very local situation, very hard to predict, and also very hard to identify the causes. With the causes, sometimes are natural, given that you have different geological layers, where the sliding of the uppermost layer is easily.
The local different characteristics.
This is something you don't have in your hands, where you can say, okay, we create a policy that changes the land use and we protect the soils from landslides. No, it doesn't operate like this. So it's a kind of a mixed area between geology and soils. And very hard to see the cause and effect through management intervention, and policies come through allow management interventions, incentives. No?
Yeah. While you're at the management question, maybe just a general kind of question on sustainable management of land and soil before we wrap up. What does that entail? What does it require? Is it feasible?
Land has many facets, as we just explored. So I would say that the responses to get to more sustainable management are also very multiple. On the first hand, we need to reduce the pressures which are now exerted on the land resources.
Like growing cities or certain agricultural practices, etc.
Yes. But at the same time, we need to promote also restoration. So avoiding degradation means that to do something better in such a way that the land is not degraded. So we have also tools for that. As I mentioned in the very beginning, that the land is subject for human systems. So it means that all kind of governance, everything which is related to better spatial planning, zoning, and really keeping to this, is another way to improve the land management. And finally, we need to look at our consumption patterns, which is not directly about land, but if we, for example, achieve less waste of food, so we can demand less products from agricultural land and so on.
Yeah. What about soil? Sustainable soil management, does that exist?
Well, it does exist, but as Andrus pointed out, land management is quite a complex issue. No, landowners want to do on the land what their right is, their free right. So it's always quite touchy to enter that domain. But we know that if we want to reduce the soil threats, the threats to land erosion. We talked about it. We also talked about soil organic matter decline, compaction, and others. This is through management. So how can we send an incentive? The first incentive that we can set is that everybody, like farmers, land managers, are aware of then if they manage their resource in a sustainable way, that has advantages for soil biodiversity, advantages for the nutrient system, for the soil stability. And so we develop guidance that addresses not only policymakers but also extension services, advisors, that discuss with us what is actually the best way in a certain region of Europe to give guidance then to the practitioners. And so we can only work on that level. The European Commission is very committed to the United Nations Voluntary Guideline on Sustainable Soil Management. For example, the promotion of cover crops prevents soils to be eroded during critical winter times. No? So there are different recommendations in that system, but in practice, when it's about applying it on the field, it's a local decision, and we can only go so and so far.
Maybe before we wrap up, any final thoughts, maybe a little glimpse of, very briefly, what the future holds for you and for you, for us?
Yeah. Just to follow up where Rainer went, that indeed to create the right incentives for land managers, that they can really deliver all ecosystem services, not only for the food production or timber production, that would be one of the key things. But in general, I'm optimistic about increased land and policy public and policy attention to the land topics. So the land degradation is becoming a central thing, which is put on the same level with biodiversity and climate change, and this makes me optimistic.
It seems to be quite closely linked to biodiversity and climate change anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Last thoughts from you?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'll try to be short. Well, we just finished our work across the whole agency on the State and Outlook of the Environment 2020 for Europe. And I must say, in this state and in this, we call it SOER, State and Outlook of the Environment in Europe, we have flagged soils as being in the, let's say, in the red zone. We are not on track with taking care of our soils properly. There are various layers. There's the private layer. There's also the political layer, the practitioner layer. It's a complex thing. We have a fantastic cooperation with countries that help us to create a knowledge base for Europe. But when we go deep in the different soil threats, for example, compaction is one of the things that we try to promote now. It's not addressed at all in policies. We have a large proportion of soils in Europe compacted. We see that in the soil moisture behavior in the winter. So I want to be involved more strongly and giving attention to areas of soil protection that we haven't really properly addressed yet.
So there's significant amounts of work to do. So with those words, I'd like to thank you both, and thank you, big thanks to our viewers. And yes, SOER State of Europe's Environment and Outlook. State and Outlook report will be published on 4th of December, so you'll hear more about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.